Buenas tardes, soy Sergio Sarmiento. Me va a tocar la presentación de un autor que realmente admiro, que me tiene embobado en estos últimos días. Me ha pedido el equipo que hable en inglés, tanto para que me entienda el señor Boyne, como por razones de interpretación, para que la gente no esté poniéndose y quitándose los audífonos. Lo voy a hacer así por esta petición. So again,
Perdón, Sergio, perdóname. Tienes la voz, acá estoy, del lado derecho.
Sí, perdón, sí es cierto, perdón, tú vas a presentar primero.
Es solo la emoción,
Sí,
Sergio, la verdad
así
es muy especial tener a John Boyne aquí en la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara. En nombre de Salamandra, en nombre de Penguin Random House, les damos la más cordial bienvenida. Qué bueno que estamos nuevamente viéndonos aquí en la Feria Internacional del Libro de Guadalajara. Gracias a John Boyne, tras ese largo viaje, por venir a acompañarnos a nosotros, sus editores, a ustedes, sus lectores. Gracias a Sergio Sarmiento, un ícono del periodismo, como lo queramos, en prensa escrita, en radio, en televisión, y todavía más importante cuando se trata de una entrevista. Su experiencia en la entrevista, en las charlas, sus habilidades, pues ya son muy conocidas, muy apreciadas, y el día de hoy vamos a poder disfrutarlas de la mano de John Boyne y de dos novelas que se comunican, de dos novelas en donde John Boyne pone el acento en su Irlanda y en temas delicados y controversiales: Las huellas del silencio y Las furias invisibles del corazón. Ahora sí, sin más, Sergio, te dejo la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Discúlpame, me salté. Bueno.
Un último aviso: terminando en el módulo de firmas del área internacional está el Salón Enrique González Martínez, y al ladito está otro salón en donde se está haciendo la firma de libros. Terminando esta presentación, ahí en el módulo vamos a hacer la firma de libros de John Boyne. Gracias.
Well, thank you Random House, thank you Salamander, thank you for everyone who's here this evening. I've already explained why I'm speaking in English. I've been asking that so that Mr. Boyne can hear me and understand me, and also to make the work of the interpreters a little easier. We're going to be presenting two books. In fact, he's just finished. He's just published in 2020 another book, A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom. I'm just going to mention that so that you'll have another book to look forward, because I hope this book is going to be published soon in Spanish. And he was telling me this morning, Mr. Boyne was telling me this morning, that he's just finished another book, so he never stops, he never rests. The two books that we're going to present today are remarkable in John Boyne's career. And let me tell you why. He's a writer that was born in Ireland, but he hasn't felt confined to the limits of Ireland. He has been written books that have actually reached universal appeal, but he doesn't feel that he has to write about Ireland just because he's Irish. And all of a sudden, he wrote two books that give us a very special look at two parts of the life of Ireland. Ireland is a very special country in Europe. It's a very Catholic country. It has been a Catholic country, forever, of course, but it has faced a tremendous transformation over the past few years. And John Boyne's two novels that we're going to talk about today are actually give us an account of how Ireland has changed over the past half a century. One of the books is a history of loneliness. In fact, I have to say that I really like the English title. The Spanish title is Las huellas del silencio. Also a very beautiful title, although a little different from the title that John Boyne actually offered us originally. And the main character in this novel is Audrey Yates. Audrey Yates, a young man who faces a tragedy and takes that to the priesthood, maybe not because he has a tremendous religious vocation, he's too young to actually have that, but because that was what was done in families in Ireland at that time. And then he happens to be involved in in what, for many people, has been the greatest shame of the Catholic Church over the past decades, which is the abuse of some priests on children, and this is something that actually touches Organ Gates. No, he's not responsible for any irresponsible behavior. He's responsible for something that could be maybe not as bad, but that could be as important for these kinds of crimes to be committed. He's actually guilty of silence. And that's the first novel that I'm going to ask John Boyne to speak about. And why don't we start with this novel? And I would like to ask you, John, to tell us a little bit about Organ Gates. And some people, I remember, I've seen some of the critics of your novel, and they say that you weren't hard enough, that you had to be very punishing, that you had to punish the Catholic Church for all of these crimes. You don't do that. You offered something totally different. Could you tell us why?
Well, firstly, good evening, everybody. It's very nice to be here in Guadalajara the second time, and thank you all for coming out. So, yes, to start with about this book, Odran is a priest in Ireland over the years who has not himself, as Sergio says, committed any crimes, but has been, along the course of the book, we realise as the readers, and he realises himself, that he has been very complicit in the crimes that many of his colleagues did. In terms of the harshness on the church in the book, what I felt when I started was, as a novelist, it's pointless to try to write something which is just a diatribe. If I had written this book when I was in my 20s or my early 30s, I think it would have been very different. I think it would have been very different. It would have been much more full of rage and a less interesting read because of that. I think with the passage of time, as I've got a little older, I've been able to think about it and write about it with more balance, and to think not about writing a book about how awful the people were who did these things, but writing a book about what happened to these people in the first place that made them commit these crimes. By understanding why people commit such crimes, there's a possibility of them not happening again. So that's really where I started from, and trying to write something that I felt was a fair account of the scandals that happened, the abuse that had happened, and why.
There's a sentence that you
actually have at the beginning of the book that really struck me. And the sentence is, I never felt ashamed of being an Irishman until I was well into my middle age. Could you tell us something about that?
Well, when Odran is in the middle part of his life, that's the time in Ireland when the country is starting to change.
Ireland really changed. I think, towards the end of the 1990s, the mid-1990s, really with when we first elected our first female president, for example, Mary Robinson, that was a sea change in Irish culture. And around the same time, people started going to the police in Ireland, telling their stories about what had happened to them and being listened to. For decades before that, when people would go to the guards, they wouldn't be listened to. They would just be told, well, the church is too powerful, we don't get involved. Take it to the bishop. And you would take it to the bishop, and then the bishop would simply move the priest who had been accused of a crime from, say, Wexford to Galway or Roscommon or Limerick, and just move the problem somewhere else. So it's in the middle years of his life that he realizes what kind of country he has devoted so much of his has devoted his life to, but what organization he has devoted so much of his time to as well, and begins to feel shame about that, and begins to feel responsibility for the things that he's done. And when I was interviewing priests for the book, especially older priests, time and again I would ask them, there was, you must have known what was going on. When I was in school, as a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, we all knew what was going on, and we were just children. Now, we knew what was going on because we were the victims of it half the time. But how could you not know? And you don't get very satisfactory answers from people, I have to say, on that.
Actually, Woodward Yates doesn't commit a crime itself. I mean, he doesn't actually go and molest a young kid. But a friend of his does, Tom Cardle. And that's when he decides, or maybe he doesn't even decide, but he keeps silence, and that's his real sin. What was going on in Audran's mind as he thinks about this?
I think the same thing that was going on in the minds of so many people that in those years, that you simply can't upset the apple cart. You know, there is nowhere to go to report these things. That no matter what suspicions you have, it's basically moral cowardice. It's saying I won't get involved. I might have my suspicions. I might see this. I might see this, but I'm just not going to get involved. We'll let someone else do it. And I think the reader comes away from the book having to ask themselves: are the people who were complicit in those crimes as culpable as the people who committed them? And I would suggest that they are, because if you know a crime is going on, especially against a child, and you do nothing about it, then I think, you are complicit in it. And you mentioned the title of the book. One of the early titles I had for the book was Complicity, but Ian Banks had called the book that.
And in fact, I have to say that I really like A History of Loneliness. Is Audran a lonely man?
Yeah, he is. I think a lot of those priests during those times were extremely lonely men. You must understand, in Ireland in the 40s, the 50s, 16-year-old boys didn't suddenly wake up one day and think, I have a vocation to be a priest. It just doesn't happen in the real world. There was very large families, of course, because contraception was illegal in Ireland. So, families were like 9, 10, 11 children. God help the poor women who have to give birth to all of these children. But every family wanted to have a priest and a nun in the family. It was a sign of, it was like a good thing to have. And some poor child would be basically selected and brought to a seminary. And, we're talking about in the 50s where people, at that age, teenagers, completely different to teenagers today, knew nothing of the world, knew nothing of sex or romance or anything. And they would simply do what they were told. And then they would wake up 7 years later and be a priest. And then they would wake up maybe 10 years later and they'll have been a priest for a decade. And they're in their 30s. And suddenly all the emotions that most of us experience when we're 14 or 15 or 16 is coming to them for the first time. And their minds have been, in my view, have been literally perverted by not being allowed to live a normal life. And then what did they do? They looked for the most vulnerable people. So and who are the most vulnerable? Who are the easiest, in a way, to abuse? Our children, because you can frighten children. You can threaten children in a way that you can't with adults. So, most of these men were incredibly lonely. Now, that's not an excuse for anything, don't get me wrong. But, I'm not being facetious when I say I blame the parents. The people who put these poor boys into these seminaries and stole their lives from them as well. They're just as responsible, I feel.
You said that U.S. kids knew what was going on who were 13-year-olds. Did the parents know?
Yeah, okay. Well, look, let me tell you, the school I went to in Dublin was an all-boys school, and it was a Catholic school run by Carmelite priests. I did 7 subjects for my leaving cert, which is whatever the final exam you do in school here. So I had 7 different teachers. And of those 7 different teachers, 4 of them have ended up in court cases. 2 of them are in jail, and 1 of them is in a court case at the moment for a case that myself and several others have taken against him for the abuse he inflicted on us when we were children. 4 out of 7. Now, the school had, I don't know, 60 teachers and 900 children. Everybody in that school knew what was going on. And as kids, we were so stupid and so naive that you would sort of laugh it off. You would think, well, that teacher likes that boy and always takes him down to the office. And you would get teased, or you would tease. You didn't realize the seriousness of it until we got older. I only started to realize the seriousness of it when I was really in my early 20s. And when I first started really, when the effects of what had happened to me as a child began to make themselves known, with me struggling with trying to form relationships, struggling with sexuality, struggling with intimacy, and you start to think, is it because the very first thing that happened to me in that sense in life was something that was unlawful and without any consent on my part? So everybody knew it, and the parents, well, parents would go to the bishops, as I say, and say, look, my son, my daughter, something has happened with the priest. And when the bishop would move that priest on, the parents really, they wouldn't do anything. If you owned, say you owned the grocery shop in town, or you owned the garage, if you were known that you had reported priests, or you were going to try to really go above the police head, no one's going to go to your shop anymore. No one's going to go to your garage anymore. You're going to lose your livelihood, and you've got 12 mouths to feed. So it's a very tricky, difficult situation.
It's peculiar that John Boyne was accused of being an Irish writer who didn't write about Ireland, and he has written 2 magnificent novels about Ireland. That's really quite surprising. The second novel that I want to introduce tonight is The Heart's Invisible Furies. And John Boyne is a very good storyteller, but he's also a very strong storyteller from the beginning. He knows how to capture a reader. His first sentence is, his first image in The Heart's Invisible Furies is a priest. It's a priest that we will get to know later on that has had children with 2 different women, 2 different children from 2 different women, excoriates a woman, a 16-year-old girl, and calls her a whore, and grabs her and takes her and expels her from the church and from the village in which they are living, Catherine and Goggin. This is how this novel, The Heart's Invisible Furies, starts. The name of the priest is Father.
It's because she's pregnant.
Because she's pregnant. So that's why she's called the whore. And what do you tell us about Father? What Father James Monroe does, and who this girl Catherine Goggin is?
Well, yeah, it starts like this. So it's not a sequel or anything, but it starts with a priest. So we take up almost where we left off with the previous book, and it starts with this 16-year-old girl. Priest is here on the pulpit, looking out at the congregation, and names her from the pulpit. Says, demands that she says the name of the man who she, of course, has seduced. She's the evil witch.
The woman always is.
Yeah, and the poor unfortunate man who somehow has, tripped and fallen into her. And she refuses to name who it is, and he drags her by the hair, drags her down the aisle out of the church, kicks her out onto the street. Her family wants nothing to do with her. She takes the bus to Dublin, and even though it's 1945 and she's only 16 years old, I try to write really strong female characters in my books, and I decided that Catherine was not going to be a victim in any way. That she makes the decision that what she's going to do is she's going to go to Dublin. She's got a little bit of money. She's stolen her mother's Christmas money, and she's going to give up this baby for adoption, and she's going to get a job, and she's going to live a life. And she's not going to let anybody, the church, or any man, stand in her way. So throughout, the novel is narrated by the child in her womb, across 70 years of his life. And throughout the novel, they cross paths every so often without knowing who the other one is. But it's really a novel about how Ireland changed over those 70 years. Because we go from the end of the Second World War until the week after the equal rights marriage referendum of 2015. And Cyril, the narrator of the book, is gay. And in 1993, when I was still in university, homosexuality was still illegal in Ireland. So it's still a crime. And only 22 years later, which is nothing in historical terms, we became the first country to actually vote, by public vote, for equal rights marriage. And I wanted to know how that had happened. What had happened in the country to make a country change so much? 22 years is nothing. But like teenagers growing up today, gay, very different from teenagers growing up then. So that's what I really wanted to write, the evolution of a country. And I do it through these two characters, really, Cyril and Catherine.
Mm-hmm. And you have a very, very peculiar way of handling time. You do it in various novels. And here you actually use 7 year intervals to actually tell the story. Tell us why.
Yeah,
I thought it was very peculiar.
Well, it's quite a long novel because it's set across these 70 years. But I decided that there would be 10 chapters and they would each be quite lengthy. But we would meet Cyril every 7 years of his life. So in the womb at age 0, then at 7, 14, and so on. And they do say that we shed all the cells of our body, all our skin, over 7 years. So we almost become a completely different human being every 7 years. But also, somebody had said to me before I wrote this book that if you think about your own lives, that there's sort of every 7 years, you're in a very different place, that something seems to happen. When I thought about my own life, every 7 years in my life, something important, something crucial, all the crucial things happen in sort of 7 year gaps. So I thought this was a good way to approach it, that every 7 years he would have changed in some way. You know, in the early sections, for example, say when he's 21 and it's 1966, and he's terrified of the fact that he's gay. All of his sexual experiences take place under cover of dark, you know, in hidden places. When he's 56 in, 2011? No, 2001. He's a completely different human being. You know, he's been in love, he's been in a relationship, he doesn't care what people think about it, he's open with his sexuality. So it's, and I've always loved those big novels of, you know, one of my favorite authors is John Irving, and I love John Irving's books of sort of like, you start from birth and you work all the way to the end. You know.
Inside a house rules.
Yeah. I have a tattoo on my arm here.
Oh, yeah?
Which says, we are all terminal cases.
It's funny, I really love John Irving, I didn't know that.
That's the last line of The World According to Garp. In The World According to Garp, we are all terminal cases. And I showed this to John one time, and he said, is that not a very depressing line? And I was like, no, it's not. It's actually, I think it's an uplifting one. Because what it's saying is, and I was telling the author what it meant, but what it's saying is, like, we're all going to die. So, you know, every wasted moment is well, it's wasted, you know. I mean, like, it is about seizing the day, seizing every moment. And God, haven't we all learned that in the last 18 months? How precious our lives were and how much we want them back again?
So we better take advantage of what we have. Huh? There's at the beginning of the book, there's an encounter that I found very touching. Catherine, who's only 16, who's on the bus to Dublin, meets a young man, a handsome young man, just a little older than she is, whose name is Sean. Tell us about Sean and how Sean is going to actually impact on Catherine's life.
Well, when Catherine first leaves West Cork and goes to Dublin, yeah, she meets this guy on the bus. And she's alone, she has nobody, and he's friendly, and they strike up a friendship, and he tells her he's also been kicked out of his home. He doesn't tell her why, but he's going to Dublin to stay with a friend of his. He's got a job in the Guinness factory on James Street, and he's going to stay with his friend. And because he's this very kind, gentle soul, he invites her to stay with them. So she does, and she sleeps on the sofa while the two boys share a bed in the bedroom. Now, of course, what she doesn't realise is that these two boys are, they're going at it in there. And that the reason that Sean has been kicked out of his home is because his father found out about this relationship. And so he's also been, excommunicated from the parish. And it's a chapter of violence, really, because Cyril is born into a moment of violence where Sean's father comes to Dublin to kill his own son, because the shame of having a son who's gay is so much that not only will he kill him, but he knows that there isn't a jury in the land that will convict him of this. So it's important to the novel that Cyril is born into violence. He's literally, as the life is leaving one person on the floor, Catherine is giving birth to another next to him. And the soul, in a way, of this kind and decent and gentle man, I think, sort of transmutes its way into the body of this tiny little baby.
The world has changed, and has changed in a dramatic way over the past 50, 60 years, or 70 years that you actually described in The Heart's Invisible Furies. But it's very surprising to see the change in Ireland. Such a Catholic country, more Catholic than Italy, for example. You've witnessed this change. You've witnessed the fact that in 1993 homosexuality ceased to be a crime in Ireland, and now you see that actually the population of Ireland voted in favor of allowing marriage among people of the same sex. What happened? Was it education? Was it the fact that people are less Catholic now? Is that the issue?
Firstly, I question how Catholic they really were, because I can remember, as a kid, we would all go to Mass every Sunday, and the whole parish would be at Mass. But it was also a moment where everybody they would go to the pub afterwards for Sunday lunch, they would buy the newspapers, they would meet their friends. It never seemed to me that it was hundreds of people gathered in a church feeling spiritual in some way. When we just sort of, the way at a Mass, there are responses, and the priest says something and everybody responds. Nobody's thinking about those things. It's just words coming out of mouths, I think. And I don't know that people were actually so religious as they claimed to be. I think it was just part of society that you went to it. But how it changed, why it changed, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that so many brave people came out in the 90s and the early 2000s and started to tell their stories, and started to go to the police, started to be heard, and the newspapers picked up on it, and the courts started to hear these cases, and the criminals started to go to jail. And a younger generation coming up, I think, realised this is not a country that we want to live in, but be part of. And I think the country was looking for a moment when it could strike back at those people and say that. Because in the days leading up to that referendum in 2015, one of the most striking things was the amount of young people say under 25, who were maybe students in other countries or were away in America on their J1 visa or had gone to Australia or something, who came back just to vote. And it wasn't because they were gay. They came back to vote because they wanted their voice to be heard. They wanted to vote yes. And it became so obvious that it was going to be a landslide, because it kept getting reported on the news at the airports, the ports, the boats, everything was flooded with young people coming home. And it was the young people and the very old people, the people who felt that they had devoted lifetime to an organization that had betrayed them. They were the two groups who voted yes. And it was the group in the middle, the 50-somethings, who voted no, and who were still sort of conservative and didn't know, were just incapable of dealing with this new Ireland. The very old and the very young, they're the ones that made it happen.
Sometimes when a writer has a narrowly very successful novel, that novel sort of seems to hang and weighed upon the entire work of his life. You had a very successful early novel, The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, and then became a very successful film. Was it good for you, or did it actually make it more difficult to write your following novels?
It was only a positive experience. That wasn't actually my first novel. It was my fifth novel, and the first four, hadn't really sold very well. They were only published in English and Dutch for some reason, and don't know why. And then Boyne the Striped Pajamas came along, and everything changed. And there are writers who kind of feel that's like a burden on their shoulders. I never did. I felt it was a great gift in my life because it gave me what every writer wants, which is a readership. It brought me. I wouldn't be sitting here probably today in 2021 in Guadalajara if in 2006 I hadn't published The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. And I'm always happy to talk about it. I'm glad that the book that broke through for me was a book with such a serious subject matter as well. And I've spent so much of my time in the intervening years in schools talking to kids about the Holocaust and making it clear to them that my novel is a fable. It's subtitled A Fable, that not everything in it is exactly as it was, but that if you're interested in the subject, here's the books you should go and read. And it's a book that does come in for criticism sometimes, and I understand that, but I also think that anything that keeps those stories alive and gets children, teenagers interested in that subject and wanting to learn about it is of value, because they're the ones who are going to be running the world soon, and we don't want those things to happen again, and we know that they do. So, no, it's never been a burden to me. It's always, I consider it one of the great gifts in my life that I had that idea and I was able to write it.
Do you despair when you read your earlier novels and you say, how could I write that?
Well, no, because I haven't read any of them.
Okay.
I haven't read any of them since I wrote them, because you spend so much time on them and you write so many drafts that you put them on the shelf, and I don't think I want to, because I have with each book in my head, I know, you can look at each book and sort of think, did I achieve artistically what I set out to achieve? And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And over the course of a lifetime, I think, for any writer or whatever it is you do with your life, I think it's okay to say that, sometimes there'll be a couple that you think, as hard as I worked on that, I just didn't get it right somehow, So sometimes I think maybe when I'm very old, I'll go back and read them. Philip Roth did that when he retired, which is a very unusual thing for a writer to do. But he retired from writing. And then he read all his books, but he read them from the end backwards. And he gave up, he said, when he got to his fifth novel, because they were so terrible. Now, of course, they weren't terrible, they were great. But to his mind, they were. So maybe when I'm old, I'll read them again. But there's too many other books to read.
I don't know if they're bad, but when I read A Bortnoy's Complaint, if I compare it to the Philip Roth of the later years, there seems to be no. It doesn't seem to be the same writer.
Well, I think you could say the same about me, and most writers, and that should be the case. I mean, I published my first novel when I was 29. I'm now 50. I'm not the same person I was when I was 29. I've had all the life experience that happens in your 30s and 40s. If I was still writing the same books, there'd be something very wrong with me, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So,
you attempted something very ambitious in The Heart's Invisible Furies by actually giving us a history of Ireland, a moral history of Ireland in many ways over the past 70 years. And then all of a sudden, I started to read your latest novel. It hasn't been yet published. I hope that Penguin Random House will give it to us very, very soon. A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom. And that's even more ambitious. I mean, it's a history of humanity.
Yeah.
Also with this very peculiar handling of time that you have. I mean, if it was peculiar to go through the history of Ireland in 7 years' time, this is 2,000 years of history in little vignettes and little narrations in different parts of the world. Tell us a little bit so that our Mexican audience gets a glimpse of what's going to come next in Spanish.
Well, a lot of my early novels were historically based, and then I hadn't written any historical books in a while. And when I finished the 2 Irish novels, I just felt this desire to write something set in the past and to get away from Ireland again for a little bit. So it's an unusual book where it's 52 chapters, and it starts in the year 0 and it ends in the year 2080. And there's 51 countries and a space station. And with each one, we move forward in time. And not with the same person, but with the narrator of each section as we move forward in time has had all the same experiences as the narrator of the previous one, just in a different point of history and a different place. And the idea of the book, really, was that no matter what changes have taken place in the world over the 2 millennia, industrial changes, technological, how we communicate, how we travel, there are some things that do not change, and that's our emotions. So my position would be that sort of, if you're a 15-year-old boy in Turkey in the year 400 and you fall in love for the first time, you feel exactly the same emotions as a Scottish boy in the 1700s falling in love for the first time. If you lose a parent, if you lose a child, you feel the same emotions that those never change through history. So that was my starting point, the idea that as people, we're exactly the same as the people who were here 2,000 years ago. We just dress differently, and we can do things like this. And 2,000 years from now, if the planet is still here, that people will still be the same, that they will still fall in love, they will still get sad if their dog dies. You know, that all the things that make us human, all the emotions. So it's a novel about emotion and about what it is to be human. And it's probably the most ambitious book I think I've ever written.
It's quite ambitious.
And it was a tricky one to write, I have to say. But I think it's an interesting idea.
Well, it's a book that the beginnings of every book that I've read, that you've written, they're always very, very shocking or very striking at first, and you really grab the reader's attention immediately. In fact, in A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom, a father is waiting for his son's birth, and well, you can probably tell it. And then he goes on and starts to do a very nasty, job that evening. And do you want to share that?
Well, yeah, it starts on the night that King Herod sends the soldiers out to kill all the baby boys, and on this same night, our narrator is born, but his father is one of these soldiers who is going out and killing all these different. So I think he kills 11 babies, on the first page of the book. But again, our narrator is the one that survives. There's a lot of violence in this book because it's over those 2 millennia. I mean, the one thing that never seems to end is wars. You know, people are always fighting about something, and so there's a lot of fighting in the book. There's a lot of war. There's a lot of women in the book who do not get an opportunity to live the lives that they should have lived until about sort of the mid 20th century or late 20th century. For the first, 1980 years, they don't have any options at all. So yeah, it's that's how it starts. It starts there, but we move into 51 different countries, and I think Mexico is one of them. I've forgotten it a couple of years ago.
Well, there's Brazil.
I had a big wall chart, and I would put pins in different countries, and I wanted to have all the world represented, so all the continents. And
I'm just reading, and I haven't finished it, so don't spoil it for me.
Yeah.
I'm gonna make you one more question. I'm gonna ask people to give us a couple of questions. We don't have much time, but if anyone wants to think about a question, they have a couple of minutes to think about the question while I make the following question to John Boyne. So think about it, and then raise your hand, and we'll do a couple of questions from the audience. I mean, it's dramatic. Your book, A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom, is dramatic. But all the books that you've written are dramatic, but you also have a very wry sense of humor. You have Donald Trump in your latest novel, in A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom, catching fire.
Yeah, he explodes.
Yeah,
He tells so many lies, he spontaneously combusts. It's one of my favorite scenes. But he just goes on fire.
But there's a sense of humor throughout. That is very peculiar. Tell us about your sense of humor. Do you try to be humorous?
Well,
because some of your stories are very dramatic, and all of a sudden.
a lot of my stories are very sad, certainly. But there is the new novel I just published in English, The Echo Chamber, is a complete comedy. It's about social media and about how we waste so much of our lives on social media and the way people talk to each other on it and the destructive elements of it. And it's a total farce. I had a rule when I started writing it, that I wanted one laugh out loud line on every single page. And it's gone down very well with people. When you write a lot of sad books, it's where everybody always seems to die at the end. It's quite nice to write a book full of jokes. Before this one, I think the only one that I wrote which was comical was a children's book called The Terrible Thing That Happened to Barnaby Brockett. But other than that, I do like the kind of elegiac, sad tone. The novel I'm writing at the moment is narrated by a 91-year-old woman looking back at her life and, like with so many of my books, all the mistakes that she's made and the regrets. But with The Echo Chamber, there's not enough humor in books. Mm-hmm. And we all want to laugh, really. Sometimes you're given a book to read and it's like won an award for being like the greatest comic novel of the year, and you read it and it's like there's no jokes in it, and it's like I just want a joke. So I tried to make that one funny, and I don't know. You'd have to ask my friends if I'm funny. I don't know, but
okay, well.
I do my best. I'm lighthearted, I think.
Yeah.
So,
any questions from the audience? Yes. I don't know if we have a microphone. Just there's a microphone here.
You can speak in Spanish if you want.
Yeah, you can speak in whichever language.
Whichever.
It's all right.
There's a mic coming.
Yeah, there's.
Oh, it's going from hand to hand to hand.
Okay, it's coming.
There's the chap and the tie-dye shirt. Yeah.
Right.
I would like to go back to something you said at the beginning, that a lot of critics to your book were that you were not too hard on the church and on the priest in your book, and I'd like to make the question that when you write a novel and then you socialize it with your friends or your family or the critics or any other writers, and then they tell things like that you are not being too hard, or you're not being too you're not judging in the right way. Do you feel intimidated, or do you feel pressure? Because I think that I don't know.
I think. I guess the question is really about criticism. Do you feel that you have to please people and give them what they want or what they expect? And I don't. I think the one important thing about literature is that it should be something that people debate and talk about, and you should write novels that are ambiguous, that you have characters like in this with Odrin. I would think readers coming to the end of it, if they talk about him, would have very different views on his role in the things that happened. I don't think it's the novelist's job to give those answers. They do say it's the novelist's job to pose the questions better, and that's what I try to do. If everybody was to say to me it was terrible, well, maybe I'd feel I'd made a mistake. But I think it's. I think you have to just let readers make up their own minds on these things and step away, and it's into the world after you've written it.
Okay, and the last question. I think. Okay.
Hello.
No, you have it. Okay, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Hi,
Hi.
John. Nice to meet you. I
You
want.
know, remove your mask while
Yeah,
to make the
okay.
question because we're not,
Thank you.
Okay.
I just want to ask you if you, what obstacles do you have when you write these two books? Because I think that is a pretty tough, with all the priests and all the subjects that you touch in the book. I think that is pretty sensitive. So I would like to ask you what type of obstacles you have writing and publishing, of course, the book.
Sorry, did you say obstacles?
Yes.
Yeah, do you face censorship? And you have 3 minutes to answer that.
Okay. Not really. I think over the course of my career, I've faced a lot of. I've had a lot of criticism at times. I've written books that seem to annoy people. There's a young person's book I wrote called My Brother's Name is Jessica, about a transgender teen, which just seemed to drive people insane. There's a lot of critics of Boyne striped pajamas. So I don't really worry about the obstacles along the way. When it came to writing about the church, I spoke to lots of priests. I wanted to know what they, I wanted to interview them before writing it. I think if you're going to be put off by what the world might make of it, or whether or not it's going to be well received, or you're going to be personally criticized for it, then you're not a writer. A writer has to have some sort of bravery behind him or herself. And in the last 3 years particularly, since the My Brother's Name is Jessica dramas, which blew up on social media and I was the worst human being in the world, you have to develop a thick skin and say, look, this is the books I write. If you don't want to read them, no one's forcing you. But you have to have some kind of moral courage as a writer and write regardless.
Well, John Boyne, thank you very much for sharing with us some of your ideas and your literature. I have to personally admit that I hadn't read your books until very recently, and I was taken, very much taken by Las Huellas del Silencio, Las Furias Invisibles del Corazon, and I'm quite taken by the novel that I'm reading right now, A Traveler at the Gates of Wisdom. Thank you very much for coming to Guadalajara and speaking with us. And thank you for Random for having us here.